Hi Rick, it's great to connect with you again. I know we talked 2 years ago for Countdown to the Moon, and you're telling me about Orbit's Edge. Building compute infrastructure actually in space, and it'd be good to get an update from you and see how your thoughts about us going to the moon and the future of humanity and that type of things kind of changed since then.
It's been a wild 2 years. We've been super busy. We're having conversations right now for companies that are producing space station modules, both in LEO, some possible stuff in GEO, and we're also interested in cislunar. Um, we're also having conversations with companies that are working on producing rovers, autonomous rovers for lunar operations. They're interested in compute and autonomy for those purposes, and it's just been a lot of stuff that has happened. We're working on a 1,000 watt compute platform, 100 watt, and a 10 watt, and the core premise is all the same: integrated radiation shielding and thermal management, so that commercial off-the-shelf compute hardware can survive space environments. And the reception over the past 2 years has been a total sea change. People are seeing that space data is more important and it will be more important. And another one of the factors is as we reach farther and farther away from the Earth's surface, the inverse square law really kicks in. And the inverse square law is basically 1 over x squared. And it says if you double the distance between you and me, the amount of energy required for us to communicate is 4 times as much. So if you double the distance a whole bunch of times, that's a whole bunch of 4 times. So the difference between the energy required to send data uh, from Leo to the surface versus the moon to the surface is a lot more, and you get fundamental limits on how much you can send back. So the need to consume that data on site where it's developed, where it's originated, is just going to get more and more important, and that's really where we feel like our play is. So we're super stoked on working on all this stuff. There's a lot of use cases for this, and we're excited to be part of this. And this is a fantastic time to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, one application I was thinking of whenever you were talking was just perhaps there's a really efficient compression algorithm that is computationally significant. I mean, to do that closer to the source
Hmm.
and then be able to send back just a little bit of data and then re-expand it.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. Compression is a big deal, and as you get into multispectral, hyperspectral, spectroscopy, all that stuff where there's just more data per square meter or whatever, um, then the data loads increase dramatically and the utility of compression increases dramatically as well. And another aspect is, back it up to tape. One of the things that we can offer is significant amounts of storage, pretty compact storage. So we could theoretically have a scenario where lots of data is generated, some is compressed and sent back, but the vast majority is stored for retrieval. And that's scenarios where the alternative is simply not getting it. Like the current ways to communicate beyond geo are the deep space network, and the deep space network is already pretty saturated, and they're basically saying, please don't use the DSN for Artemis missions. We just can't support that sort of stuff. It's too much already. We already have too much load. So various ground station operators are expanding out their ground stations, but the satellites, the receivers they need to collect that, they're freaking huge. They're like, I think think it's at least 4 meters across to be able to communicate from the moon to the Earth's surface,
Wow.
and that is significant. I'm waiting to see some geo relays. I think that'd be a fantastic way to do it. Have relays that are looking at the moon in geosynchronous orbit. You'd need an array of them, but I feel like that'd be a pretty good way to do it at reduced power requirements. But I haven't seen that anybody is working on fielding that yet.
That would be interesting. You know, as you're talking about Artemis and not using DSN for that, it reminded me of a talk given by the CEO of Intuitive Machines that has like the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. They had actually built out their own kind of like lunar communications network, which is kind of neat. So I think you'll see more of those popping up.
It's going to be necessary. Especially if we're going to do it not in boots and footprints, flags and footprints. If we're going to do it sustainably and this time to stay, that means infrastructure. That means capabilities. That means stuff that endures. And communications networks are part of that. Navigation is part of that. Power management, surviving the lunar night, realistically, I don't see a way to do it without nuke. Solar's great for 2 weeks at the time. If you're near some of the permanently lit regions, then it can be great, all the time or almost all the time. But if you're going to be somewhere in the mid latitudes or equatorial, you're going to need to just straight up survive 2 weeks of darkness. And I don't see how you can do that because the temperatures are very cold. It's very cold for that 2 weeks. And obviously that's, like a gradient and it's coldest before the dawn, but still, you're going to need a power source that can operate for 2 straight weeks. So.
And ground based or surface based, I guess would be better. Nuclear, energy reduction is actually something that's being developed as well. So it looks like some movement in the right direction.
It's super important, and I would also say that so on the Earth, if you're out in the desert and you dig down into the ground for a bit, you find a depth at which you have a temperature equilibrium. Somewhere between it's kind of the average of daytime high and nighttime low, and it's kind of between there. But if you go deeper still, you get to a yearly average where it is very constant and it doesn't really shift more than like a degree or so from summer to winter. Obviously, once you've got airflow going in, that changes and all. But the moon has the same sort of thing where once you get past a certain depth, then you reach the equalized temperature between the day and night cycles. And that is also a good place to live apart from the surface. And personally, I don't like the idea of living on the surface, especially in a dome. That seems terrifying to me. But living in a cave and visiting the surface sounds really appealing. I kind of like low lifetime radiation doses. And I also like things that are strong enough to not get smashed by a rock and then.
Maybe we like, the zoo here in Houston, they had a exhibit where it's like you get to feel like a groundhog or a gopher, I guess, and you get to crawl through all these tunnels and pop your head up in these lovely domes to look around, get back down.
Well, cupolas.
Cupolas, yeah, exactly.
Yes, I'd be fine with that. I would be perfectly fine with that, especially if it's got like steel petals that close down over the cupola, kind of like they do on the ISS.
Right.
I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, that could be a way to kind of get the view and also be there because it's like that joke, I joined the Navy to see the world and then they stuck me in a submarine.
Yeah, yeah, and that's I feel that those folks um can provide a lot of knowledge on how to conduct these operations. Everything from how to maintain the power plant, how to design the power plants, to just the psychology of how do you live that long in those conditions. It's it's not an insurmountable problem, but it is definitely a problem that needs a certain degree of consideration. If you look at some of the age of exploration voyages and some of the ships, some of the wooden ship voyages of the past 500 years where we have records of it, um, there really wasn't a lot of in-depth psychological screening, and they didn't really have ship's counselors, and they generally did more or less okay. But there were a certain number of people who went crazy and attacked other people or threw themselves overboard or attempted to set their ships on fire or various problems. Um, that's probably less desirable unless we probably have less of an appetite for that than they did, 400 years ago. Our risk matrices are a little bit different, and we have the ability to mitigate against a lot of that. But I don't think it's quite as bad as some of the stuff we've looked at in modeling and analog missions. But yeah, it's definitely something that we have to account for and definitely have to figure out how to overcome.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about the wooden voyages and the personnel selection. I remember listening to Endeavor, no, not Endeavor, Endurance, about Ernest Shackleton's Royal Trans Antarctic expedition, and they talked about his crew selection. He said according to the book, he was able to size up people in minutes and determine whether or not they would be on the crew or a bad fit, what have you. Some people have the skill.
Didn't that one actually turn out pretty good?
Everybody survived.
Yeah,
Yes. Uh, yeah, everybody survived, but it was
that
like
was
quite hardship.
that was also a really well planned in terms of provisions and everything else expedition, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
W-
he had previous experience too.
Yeah, wasn't there also another expedition that was basically the opposite, where most everyone died in the same rough area at the same time?
That I don't know about. In the endurance book, they were really focused on Shackleton, but I didn't hear any mention about another expedition.
Um, there was so I remember reading one time, and this was unrelated. It was a book about South Africa, and it basically followed people over a period of 10,000 years. Obviously, a lot of the people were hypothetical people, um, but based on reality. And one of the things that struck me was two ships setting sail for South Africa from the same destination at the same time. And one of the ships, it was a pleasant voyage with the amenities of home. For the other ship, it was like a 25% mortality rate.
Wow.
And they were both passenger ships. And for both captains, they considered it just the normal way of doing business. And one had an emphasis on, good, clean, fresh food and preserved food. They had citrus. They had looked at what caused the problems and worked to mitigate those problems. and the other had said, all that stuff costs money. I'd rather just throw a quarter of the passengers overboard when they die. And one's just as good as the other as far as I'm concerned. Um, so it really is that dichotomy of what you can do about things versus what you actually do about things, and how you can just ignore the current state of the art to other people's detriment.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, all you have to do is go look at like medical practices in like the 1800s and about, people. I mean, surgeons wash their hands after surgery. Why would you wash them before? So you're gonna have to do it again.
And that's when gosh, I remember reading about some of that where they would just about have races to see who could cut the leg off fastest. And you know, sawing it off in like 45 seconds. Um and then your patient has between either a 25% chance of survival or death. It's highly variable. Um gosh, yeah, that's kind of horrifying. And the way the way lead balls, um the way they hit bone and smash it, so there wasn't really an option to reconstruct bones, and you're going to get sepsis anyway. So if you get hit and it hit the bone, you're just going to lose, like 3 inches above whatever that got hit.
Hmm. That is awful.
Yeah.
Well, Rick, there's a couple of questions I wanted to get your thoughts on before we had to wrap up. So when we talked 2 years ago, Artemis was planning to put humans on the moon in 2024, and that slipped to 2025. How has that affected kind of your thoughts on us getting back to the moon?
Um, I thought the ridiculously compressed timeline was impossible, but also necessary. Um, our biggest problem, I've seen it for space exploration, has been this metronomic shift from moon to Mars and back and forth. Each administration secure in the knowledge that neither one will ever happen because they're outside of the political time horizon. By compressing it to inside the political timelines, I think that made it more possible, more feasible. And then you've always got your I wish they had done this differently or that differently, but by compressing that, it also gave the opportunity to start the Artemis Accords, and by getting other countries to have skin in the game, it gave us all a better chance of completion, because now you have sunk cost from our partner and allied nations, which means we're less likely to leave them holding the bag, and we're more likely to actually follow through on it. I just saw an article today where the Japanese company iSpace has gotten a license from Japan to bring lunar regolith back to Earth for sale to NASA.
Wow.
Presumably also some to JAXA. Um, that's a big deal. That's a level of international cooperation that simply was not would have been aspirational before Artemis and the Artemis Accords. Um, Granted, we've got a long history of cooperation with ISS, and that's fantastic and important, and it needs to continue. but it's also the framework for this new generation of cooperation and expansion into redefining deep space.
It's an amazing time. Well, Rick, I wish we had more time to talk, actually. It'd be good to stay in touch and maybe do an update in another couple of years and
For
see how
sure.
things progress.
I'd love to do that or sooner. Yeah.
Well, Rick, I better let you go. And thank you again so much for reconnecting.
Yeah, always. It's been fantastic, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.